Afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the Emergency Response Planning Tool. My name is Phoebe James and I'm a Professional Development Officer with the Hunter New England and Central Coast Primary Health Network. This session is being recorded. The recording and the PDF slides will be available on the PHN website in the Education Library in the coming days. Please put any questions you have in the questions box and we'll get to them if we have the time. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ellen Senft, Manager, Disaster and Emergency Coordination with the Hunter New England and Central Coast Primary Health Network. Thanks, Ellen.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the Emergency Response Planning Tool. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we are on today. I'm currently on Awabakal country, and I want to acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are Australia's First Nations, and I recognise that these lands were never ceded. The Primary Health Network recognises their unique cultural and spiritual relationship to the land, waters and seas. We also acknowledge their rich contribution to society and the traditional knowledge First Nations Australians have to offer to us and to our future generations to be the turning point of reconnecting humanity with land and culture again. Before we kick off, apologies that you can't see my face today. My camera is not working. I still want to introduce myself. My name's Ellen Senft. I'm the Manager for Disaster and Emergency Coordination. Before I joined the Primary Health Network, I worked as a dentist and was a primary care provider for over 8 years. And from that time, I know how important business continuity planning is. I went through situations like loss of key staff, electricity outages of essential machines, burglary, violence against staff. And these are just examples for incidents we face as primary care providers when we run a practice. And what really helped my practice overcome those situations was a team that was well informed about what to do in an emergency. For example, how to shelter safely, who to escalate to, where important infrastructure is located. And this also supported overall staff well-being and resilience. So today we will cover why planning for a disaster or emergency is important for practices. You will understand what's included in the ERPT tool and the ease of use. We will show you some examples of when the ERPT has been used and the outcome. And then we will have enough time for a question and answer session. You can type your questions into the chat. This is the disaster management cycle. It's contained of preparedness, response, recovery, prevention, and planning. In recent years, the Hunter, New England, and Central Coast regions have been affected by various disasters. We had severe weather events, mass casualty events, the pandemic, recently an earthquake, flooding, bushfires, you name it, we almost have it all. And in addition, we have cybersecurity incidents. Those become more and more prevalent across the sector. And we also face staff shortages and frequent turnovers. And that all makes emergency planning processes more complex. In preparation for emergencies and disasters and to reduce the vulnerability, it's recommended that primary care practices have a business continuity plan in place to safeguard the staff and business continuity. You will see the important steps for practices in the disaster management cycle. On the next slide, I have circled them in every single step where business continuity planning is essential. So you work in the preparedness to your plan. That also affects your response, how well you're able to safeguard your business. If you're interested in the other elements, for example, response in practice or evacuation center support, how you can support your local community during a disaster, please follow this link. This is a different topic. We have another webinar covering that. Having a good business continuity plan also affects the recovery of your business and makes it easier to review and adapt your lessons learned. Having this good plan makes you very agile to respond to disaster events. And a well-developed business continuity plan also reduces the risk of financial loss, and it ensures a smooth recovery if you ever become affected by disruptions or a disaster. Having an extensive but compact business continuity plan also enables delegation. So you could pass the task over to a manager, for example. And it also makes it easier to practice your plan in exercises to ensure that all staff is onboarded well and knows what to do when adversity strikes. This is especially important as practice teams become larger and the staff turnover becomes more frequent. I will now hand over to John Williams, Chief Compliance Officer at HealthPoint New Zealand, who co-developed the ERPT together with the RSCGP. Before I do that, if you're interested and you like what you hear today, if this resonates with you and you would like to use the ERPT, apply for a Primary Health Network funded 12 months license at this link. Take the right step to prepare for the upcoming Australian summer. And now I will hand over to John. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Ellen. I'm just going to share my screen, just bear with me. And just go into presentation. It's interesting, Phoebe. That.
I can see your presentation. I'm just waiting for you to put it into presentation mode.
Yes, I know. Yeah, for some reason it's deciding not to do that now.
Do you want to start from scratch?
I will. I will just stop sharing. Okay, do you want to give me that share again?
Yeah, done it
Great.
now. Sorry, everyone.
Thank you.
As you can imagine, it's always IT.
It is. And we did practice this, and now it's not playing ball. I'll start talking anyway. So look, thank you everybody for joining me this afternoon. We'll try and, I'll just stop sharing as I'm talking and we'll try it again. Okay, if you wouldn't mind, Phoebe.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, I think we're good now. That's better. Apologies. Okay, hopefully you've got it this time. How does that look all right, Phoebe?
Yes, that looks very good, John. Thank you.
Okay, apologies, folks. All right, look, the ERPT, we've been partners with the RACGP since 2013, and we regularly catch up with the Royal Australian College of GPs just to make sure that we review the content and make sure it's still relevant to today and specifically to you as a general practice. So what's the importance of a GP practice having an emergency and pandemic plan? Now, Alan's covered a lot of why it is important, but general practice, as you know, and community pharmacy, but more so general practice, is really the linchpin of Australia's healthcare services. It's the place where most people go to for their first health experience. So general practice teams are the forefront of medical care, providing Australians with access to essential health services. And particularly in a crisis situation or an unplanned event, they're often accessed more actively. And it's very important that general practices are able to continue providing essential services during an unplanned or a critical event. And so therefore, it's imperative to have an up-to-date emergency response plan. Now, Alan alluded to it in the beginning around making sure that your practice is kept open. And that is an important consideration. The RACGP, about 2 years ago, they did some analysis and they said that an average 4-person GP practice, if they can't keep their doors open for the day, from a revenue perspective, that can impact the practice somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 per day on average. So it is important. You're never going to stop a unplanned or a critical event happening, but it's about how you are prepared to deal with that and how you bounce back. So emergency and pandemic planning is not consistently used typically by primary care, and that's why we really started working with the RACGP to make sure that there was some consistency around planning and process, and that the resilience of primary care was really taken into account, because it is critical for you to be able to provide and keep providing those services to your community. So what does it actually do and what's it for? So the ERPT assists general practices in better preparing for, responding to, and recovering from the impacts of emergencies and pandemics. So as I mentioned, we have been working with the college for some time, and the content is reviewed every year. In fact, we are currently undergoing a review process, and we're just putting in some new content into the ERPT as we speak, and I'll cover that off in a couple more slides. So making sure that you keep your plan up to date. Ellen also alluded to this in her introduction, because if you have staff changes or you have a change in supplier, it is important that you can actually have a plan that is enables you to make those changes and keep your plan current and up to date. Because if anything happens and you haven't done that, you may find that some of that information is not specifically useful at that point in time. Now, the other important component, because we work with a college, it is the RACGP recommended tool for practices to build their own emergency and pandemic response plan. As such, it meets the 5th edition of the GP standards towards your accreditation. And the accreditation process does rely on having a up-to-date emergency plan and pandemic plan in place. So the tool meets all those accreditation standards. I'll just also make a comment about what that's going to look like going into 2025 and 2026. Now, what we do know in our conversations with the RACGP is the tool is going to be kept relevant and updated, and it's going to comply with the 6th edition of the GP standards, which are out for consultation at the moment, and that consultation will continue through into mid-2025. At some point in early 2026, likely to be the first quarter, the 6th edition of the GP standards will be available for practices to comply with. Now, you will have a grace period, so practices will be able to either comply with the 5th or the 6th edition for a period of time. Last time when we moved from the 4th to the 5th edition, it was about a 6-month grace period that enabled. Now, in the 6th edition, there will be a new component added into the ERPT around testing your plan. That's not currently in here at the moment, but that is going to be something that will be included sometime through 2025. Okay, so what are some of the potential risks? Again, Alan mentioned some of these. There's a plethora of them. And you're in an environment, as we are as well, where there's many environmental risks, but it's also things that can disrupt your practice or organization. And it could be something like a loss of power. It could be your IT systems go down. It could be a telephone system disruption, or you could even have a burst water pipe. So you need to be prepared for all of those things. Unfortunately, more latterly, and that was really on the back of the COVID period, there was much more aggression and violence towards staff, and I'm sure many of you would have seen that. And so we added in some sections, or we call them modules, into the ERPT to deal with that kind of behaviour, which did become more prevalent. So in 23, there was modules added around mental health support services for new staff and existing staff. And that was really, again, on the back of what happened over COVID, because there was a lot of stress put on practice staff members. There was a new module on patient aggression and violence, as mentioned, and there was a new module or component put in around telehealth. We made some additions and edits to existing modules around key contacts, complete or partial loss of practice premises, the pandemic section, and the COVID safety plan. And there are going to be some edits, as I mentioned, very shortly that will be available prior to the end of the year. Now, the benefit of having an online tool is you can complete your plan now, and we will notify you if any changes are made. So the one that's probably worth mentioning right now is that there is mention right through the tool currently of the word staff. Now, recent tax changes where you may have a GP who is contracting to your practice, if they are deemed as a staff member, there are some tax implications to that. So we're taking the word staff out of the tool completely, and we're replacing it with two words, team member. We are updating the pandemic section to reflect more respiratory conditions rather than COVID, and we're pulling the COVID safety plan right out of the tool. So what does the ERPT do, and what does it help in terms of across a region, whether it's a Department of Health initiative or it's a PHN region, as in this case? So what it does is it ERPT usage provides consistency, and it increases sector resilience and capability, because it's about thinking about what you need to prepare and plan for, and about preparing in that way and communicating that internally. So the outcomes sought by using the ERPT across a region are better resilience across the sector and capability, increased transparency for you as a practice, but also the PHN around emergency planning, including some analytics about how far you've got in your plan, improving a response if any disruption or unplanned event happens. And I'll talk about some examples at the end of this. Improved engagement, hopefully, between the PHN and your practices, and an increased understanding of the importance of emergency and business continuity planning. So all pre-thought by practices ahead of anything possibly happening is a really good thing. So before I get in and show you the tool itself, and you'll see a URL in there, that is where you onboard. The easiest way is to Google ERPT, and you will find that it will be probably the top result when you do that. Now, just before I just open up for questions, before I move into the tool itself, a little bit about the security, because I think that's an important thing. We get asked this quite a lot. Now, you see the URL is through the RACGP site, and then you've got the standard login. That is then coupled, so there's a gateway, to an AWS platform, Amazon Web Service platform. The servers are located in Sydney, and we believe those big cloud providers are really good. It's their reputation that cybersecurity is up to scratch. The other additional thing that we do is we do penetration testing on the platform every year. And for those of you that don't know what a pen test or a penetration test is, it's a third party who tries all sorts of different ways to break into the platform. And therefore, what they do is they highlight or they identify any vulnerabilities, which then we have to look at what are the mitigation strategies, how do we close those off. We did find a couple of minor areas in the last pen test that have since been closed down. So, excuse me, all I can say to you at this point is that the tool is about as robust as it can be from a cybersecurity perspective, because you are putting proprietary information into the tool itself. So at this point, any questions? I'll just get out of here and I'll go to the tool itself. Now tell me when you can see that. Phoebe?
Yes, John, looks good. Thank you.
Okay, great.
We can
Thank
see
you.
the
Thank you,
website.
Tom. Yeah.
Sorry, was that a question?
I was just saying that it's coming through fine. Sorry.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Appreciate that. So what you've got, keep in mind that this is an online tool. So it's a what we call a SaaS platform, software as a service. So it's got a standard, very modest price to make this available, no matter where you're located in Australia. That means you can access it anywhere with your own unique username and password. Now, what I've done is I've logged into the tool itself, and this is what I see. Now, down the left-hand side, I'll just go through and give you a bit of a navigation around the tool itself. You'll see the different, what we call modules, but you can call them sections if you like, that are included in here. Alan mentioned some of these as well that are important from a business continuity perspective. Things like loss of power, disruption of water and gas, disruption of telecommunications, loss of IT, some of the risks that you could be exposed to, etc. So this is how you navigate through the tool. You click on each of these particular modules. What you'll find, and the best way to think about the ERPT is it's like having an expert in emergency response planning sitting on your shoulder, guiding you through and asking you some questions that you may not necessarily have asked yourself about putting a plan together. So I'm going to go through and just look at a few modules. And again, if you've got any questions as we go through, please don't hesitate to ask. You'll see at the top left-hand side, there's a video tutorial. I would be so bold as to say that given the tool is very intuitive to use, you are unlikely to need to watch that. Okay. So what I'm in now, as you can see at the top of each section, I'm in module 1 or section 1. So that aligns to that module 1 on the left-hand side. This is where you can put the information about your practice, your physical address, your single point of contact, including phone, email, who's the emergency coordinator for your practice, where are the hard copies of your plan located. Now, experts in emergency response planning and the college and ourselves recommend that you have at least 2 hard copies of the plan available. And these are updated versions. And we would recommend you have 1 on-site and 1 off-site at least. Now, the 1 on-site needs to be communicated to all your staff members so that they know that where they can get hold of it if they need to. And say, for example, the practice manager or the principal GP is not around and they need to pick it up. And they've got something that's happened and they need to find out exactly what to do. Therefore, they would go to their hard copy plan to do that. And similarly, the principal GP or the practice manager may have a copy at home. And there's a really good example that I'll share with you in central Melbourne where that was very important that they actually did that. So this is where you include details, more details about the physical address of your practice, other contact details, which state you're in. So if you're in New South Wales, you can then pick the PHN that you're in. So I would therefore go to Hunter, New England and Central Coast. Now, the reason that that's important is that when we are looking at finding out how far you've progressed in your plan, we can never see the details, but we can pull a log out just to say, oh, okay, you've had the plan for a while, but you haven't advanced that far because you've got other priorities. And we will reach out to you and say, do you need a hand, for example? So if we know which PHN region you're in, we can do that more easily. Then there's an approval date and who's going to approve the plan. And this is where you can enter the staff details. And this is really flexible, and the tool is designed with flexibility in mind. So what we ask for the practice manager, who typically we work with, is to put in all your staff members, okay? And in this instance, in this example, and this is a demonstration plan, put in the practice manager, the principal GP, other GPs that work there, your practice nurses, for example, your receptionists, and perhaps some allied health providers. Now you keep adding, clicking on that button, and so the tool is flexible enough to add as many as you like. People quite often say, well, do I need to enter everybody into the tool itself? Keep in mind that if anything unplanned happened and you needed to contact all your staff members, that's how you should think about inclusion into this part of the tool. So just by way of background, anything with this gray background, you can basically type in there whatever you want. Now, if we are setting up an orientation or training session with you, we would typically go in here and enter a lot of these details before we have that session. And we would strongly recommend that we do that. Also, as you enter staff members in, it will automatically develop a staff call-in tree by function. So the emergency coordinator, then medical nursing, admin, and allied health, with all their contact details in there. Okay, so I'm now going to just jump into module 2. So just bear with me. Okay, so module 2 is where you enter information about your support agencies and your suppliers. We activate your emergency support agencies. Now, this is all the contact numbers for those emergency support agencies within your region. And we'll activate that, as I mentioned. And then, because we don't know who your providers are, this does take a little bit of time to input this data. We've put some pre-headed boxes in here, and you can complete these. We do suggest when we are training or talking with the practices or practice manager is that you break your ERPT development or completion into chunks. So do 2 to 3 modules a week, but set yourself an end time. And that way it's not too arduous. You can work on it as you go. And it's not a bad idea, given we know how busy you are and how in demand, particularly practice managers are, that you may decide to do a couple of hours working from home. You can log in, because it's online, with your username and password, and you can complete some of the stuff. But as you go, you must remember to save your changes. And when you're happy everything's in there, you tick that black button, the section is complete. So we've put in some of these pre-headed boxes: power supply, gas, water, air conditioning, so on and so forth, even down to solicitors and accountants. Now, once you've got all the content in there, and it does take a little bit of time to get it in there, it will only take you about 30 minutes each year to review it. And that's the real benefit. And what it does, and a lot of practices tell us this, is that it pulls everything together about your practice into one document. So it's very useful from that perspective. So that's key contact information. Now, I will just highlight the fact that 1 and 2 are the 2 modules we recommend you complete first. And the reason that we do that is, let me jump down, I'll come back out as well, and I'll jump into loss of power supply to the practice. You'll see It's asking for information about who is your electricity main supplier and who is your electrician. Because we entered that into module 2, it pulls it directly from module 2 into here, so you don't have to re-enter it. Similarly, because I've completed module 2 secondly about your suppliers, if I look into, sorry, not your suppliers, your staff members, if I look into the pandemic section as an example, and because I've put all my staff members in, I can then allocate responsibilities. So who's going to be the pandemic leader? And all the people I put in 1 appear here, and I can include the right person. So that's why it's important to do 1 and 2 first. Module 3 is the mental health support services that were put in place last year by the RACGP. Now, it's asking the question, firstly, do you have an EAP program? Many practices don't. I would say the practices that we deal with, probably about 30%, would have exposure to an employee assistance program. Either they've organised it themselves, or perhaps the PHN has one in place that they can access. If not, you just untick it. So it's because it's not important for you if you don't have one. But then there's some support programs, so an RACGP GP support program with a direct link to what is involved and a 1300 number. The same with the Doctors for Doctors program, and the same with the Essential Network 10 for health professionals, which can be accessed by any member of your practice staff, and a couple of numbers that the college put in there. So you can also add your own. Again, the same flexibility runs right through the tool itself. I will have a look at risk identification because I think this is an important one. Now, this is a series of risks that were identified and developed in terms of what you need to do to prepare, respond, and recover from. Now, these risks are common right across general practice in Australia, no matter where you are. However, the priorities may be different depending on where you're located. And this series of risks came from a working group from the RACGP that included practice managers, practice nurses, and GPs. And they said this is a fairly common set of risks that practices could be exposed to. So, and I've put them in this order for reasons I'll explain. So structural fire, smoke, pandemic, bush or grass fire, flooding, threatening behaviour, heat wave, explosion, emergency exterior to the practice, tropical cyclone, severe weather or storm, gas chemical incident, etc. And you can move these up and down in priority by these arrows to the right. I always put fire near the top because even though the likelihood is very low, the risk is extremely, or the consequences are extremely high. And I'll use a specific example now just to illustrate that. I've been made aware of at least 6 occasions in the last 3 years where a practice has unfortunately had a fire and it is not accessible the next day. There was a practice in central Melbourne, and I was talking to the practice manager about 2 years ago, and they were broken into at 2 a.m. in the morning and set on fire. The practice was completely demolished. Luckily, the practice had thought about what to do should that situation have occurred. And when I get down to this section here, complete or partial loss of premises, and I'll jump in here now to illustrate this, they had actually considered where they would go from an alternate site perspective. So you've basically got 3 choices. You either shut your doors until you can get your practice up and running again, you can use telehealth or work remotely, or you can go somewhere else. And they had decided to go somewhere else. So it took them less than a week. Now that sounds a reasonably long period of time, but if they hadn't done any planning at all, it would have taken a lot longer. And within 1 week, they were set up at the new location with everything up and running because they'd given it thought and discussed it internally and had put a plan in place to deal with that. So that's why it is important to think about that situation. So just getting back to risk identification. So as I mentioned, we've got all those. What you can do as well, excuse me, is you can add your own. I was talking to a practice in Cooper Pedy about 6 months ago, and they had a mice plague, and so they put vermin infestation. Now that wouldn't be too common, I wouldn't think, But it is important to be able to tailor this to specific events that could happen around you in terms of your location. So there's risk identification. Then we jump into the specific modules around loss of power, disruption of water and gas, and telecommunications, and loss of IT systems. I'm not going to go through all those for time's sake, but I'll just jump into loss of power and just show you the kind of things it asks you to think about. As I mentioned, it brings in your electricity supplier and your electrician. It's also asking who would be the key contact in the practice if you had a short-term power outage. Now, we would typically put the practice manager's mobile number in there because that would typically be who would need to be notified. We would also ask to put in very specific details about where your switchboard, electrical switchboard, is located, and try and be as specific as you can, because if you're not around and your principal's not around and you've got a relatively new staff member, they may not know if they have to go and turn the power off in a hurry for whatever reason, where that's located, and they need to know that. And then, does your practice have a UPS, an uninterruptible power supply? And who looks after that? How long does it last for, and what is it connected to? Typically, it's your computer network. And then, do you have a power generator? Now, if you're rural, you're probably more likely to have a power generator set up. If you're metro, less likely. But it gives you the ability to toggle that on and off as well. And then if you don't have one, and you're without power for a certain period of time, then you may want to consider hiring one. And you can do that through a local supplier. You'd ring them up, you'd put all their details in there. Medical facilities, specifically general practices, would get precedent. Generally, if that's the case, you just need to contact the provider and make sure that is the case. And then some evacuation planning and contingency measures to think about. So what it's asking you to do is think about all the things that are going to make life easier should you have a power outage, in terms of how can you bounce back more quickly. The same for disruption of water and gas, telecommunications, loss of IT. Now, I will highlight in loss of IT, one thing that I'm particularly hot on, and that is your most important assets. So what are you doing from a backup perspective? What, in terms of your computer network, you may be cloud-based, which is great, but you may have a server on site as well. So how often are you backing up? How's it backed up? Who are you getting to back it up? And how often are you getting that particular organization or person to check it and test it? Because that's really important. Because if you have a data breach or you lose data, you are in typically for either a fine or trying to recover information that is very difficult to do, or both. Okay, there is in here, module 7A, a cyber incident response module. And that is some very pragmatic advice should certain cyber events happen. It could be malicious, or it could be a mistake internally where somebody clicks on a phishing link. And so what this does is it just says, right, if you receive a suspicious email, you do these things. So there's a whole lot of different scenarios, even down to websites being hacked, data breaches, ransomware attacks, etc. So it's very comprehensive and very practical. Quite good training material for new staff, by the way. We've got a section on telehealth. We've got sections on loss of medical supplies and equipment and furniture. Now, what's included in there is what equipment do you need to deliver core services to your patients and your community. And typically, your practice nurse would complete this. So we've put some pre-headed boxes in here. So even things like PPE, medical supplies like doctor's bags, etc., pharmaceuticals, vaccines, and other supplies that may be important to you as an organisation. And again, it's got the flexibility for you to add as much or as little as you need to. The unique identifiers section enables you to put in one place information that is important to your practice, like your bank account, your GST, your ABN number. And then you can put in your registration provider, prescriber, and indemnity if you wanted to for your GPs, for your nursing staff, and for your allied health providers. So it's all captured in one place. Then there's a module on communication during an emergency response. Who would you need to communicate to and how are you going to do that? What insurance do you cover? Have you thought about loss or non-availability of key staff? For example, in the pandemic, quite often, whole practices just had no staff available. So what would you do then? Would you use a locum agency or would you go somewhere else? Is there a sister practice down the road that you could borrow staff from in the short term? There's a business continuity planning section. Okay, so what are some of the priority functions and activities that you would need to make sure you get up and running first? Things like Medicare billing, maybe provision of GP services to an aged care facility. That would be a pretty important one to get up and running quite quickly if you're bouncing back from an unplanned event. Okay, and then we've got a pandemic module, the COVID safety plan, which is all pre-populated, and most of that's pretty fit for purpose. Recall too, at the beginning I said that's going to be removed later in the year, but you can complete it if you want to. Most of you will have one anyway, but in most cases they're becoming more redundant anyway. Then there's this module on patient aggression and violence. Again, this was developed by the RACGP and really it sets a practice policy in here that's all in here by default. You can change it or add to it if you want to. Then there's a definition, and then there's some early intervention strategies to de-escalate bad behavior, responding to the act immediately, and what about the follow-up response? And so typically we go through the practice and just tick all those boxes and it's ready to go. The last module is the pandemic one, and the pandemic module is very in-depth and it takes you through key roles and responsibilities. So the pandemic leader, what are their responsibilities? The backup to the pandemic leader, the communication coordinator, typically the practice manager, considerations around staff rostering, staff members willing to work, an immunisation register, so who's been immunised in what and when, all in one place, and a training register, who's been trained in hand hygiene, infection prevention and control, cleaning, application, removal of PPE, and then what equipment and supplies have you got? Consumables, again, your practice nurse would typically do that, and then an infection prevention and control register, and then managing the cleaning policy and managing the facility during a pandemic. So quite a comprehensive module in its own right. Both those comply. So the Managing Emergencies in General Practice is a guideline that the college put out a few years ago, since been modified, of course. And the pandemic, Managing Pandemics in General Practice, this is what this specific module has been based on. So that's the tool itself. And then once you're happy with all the content and you've ticked that little black button down the bottom right-hand side, it puts that green tick on the left-hand table of contents. It's important to have that there because what that then does is it says that that particular module or section will print in the published version. You then come down the bottom left-hand side, you click on Publish a Version, and it will print. It will default to your printer setup and it will print an A4 PDF document, which is typically about 60 pages long, but all pages are numbered. There's a table of contents, and it just makes things really easy to access and update in an ongoing way. So that's a bit of a whirlwind, and we've got 15 minutes left. That's a bit of a whirlwind just to go through why the ERPT is important, and I'll just get out of that, why it's important and why you need to consider using it and keep it updated. So I'm happy to take any questions, Phoebe or Eleanor.
Thank you so much, John. Really comprehensive. There was a lot in there, but very comprehensive. So thank you. I do implore everyone who has joined us to send through any questions that you do have. I have had a few come through. John, what support is offered to practices? Do you help them fill out the template?
Yeah, thank you, Phoebe. Yes, we do. Typically, what we would do is we would ask you to, once you register, we would send you some supporting documentation and also a link to book a video training or orientation session. in that session, we would get probably 4 to 5 modules fully completed with you, and the great majority partially completed, so that you feel really comfortable and on your way. And we would really support that you do that. And Alan and the PHN have got the resources to help you do that as well. But we would automatically send that link to you once you register.
Amazing. And with the data that is input, who has access to that?
Only the person that has input the data. Now, I will preface that by saying, because once you register, you get your own unique username and password. Now, that is unique to you. We don't know what your password is. But if you ask us and come to us and say, oh, I've forgotten my password, or you don't click on the forgotten password link because maybe somebody's moved and you haven't kept the admin details up to date, then we can reset that password for you, but we have to put that in the audit trail. So you can come to us, but just keep in mind what we do recommend is that for each practice, you have a maximum of 2 people that have access to the tool online with that username and password. Any more, it becomes unwieldy, and you don't want too many people in there making changes that you may not be aware of. The hard copy is really the output, and that's why we recommend if a couple of people have access to the tool, or 1, they make the changes, they publish a version, and then that's the current version that then people can access inside the practice.
Okay. Gabrielle, I did request for you to come off mute if you wanted to say your question. If you have any issues, more than happy for you to type it into the chat. A question has come through, are many specialist practices using this?
Good question. Yes, they are. Keep in mind this was designed by the RACGP, so there is reference to general practice through the tool. So we do have a number of specialty practices. We've got anaesthetic practices, we have got medical specialist practices, we have got allied health providers that do use it, but there's that caveat there. We do have another online tool that is available for SMEs that is quite, so small to medium enterprises, of which a general practice typically is, or a specialist medical service, that is also available. It's a very similar online tool to this one.
Gabrielle was able to put her question through the question box. Thank you. As this is not on our servers and there's always a chance of someone not from our organisation with access, you have people's medical information, if there is a breach, who is legally held responsible?
Okay, there's an easy answer to that. You shouldn't be putting any information that is patient specific into the ERPT. There is obviously the security is important to us. So proprietary information about your practice is in the tool, but nothing more. In terms of other stuff that you have got on your own servers that has got patient-specific information in there, I'm afraid that is your responsibility, not ours.
This is around because you input staff vaccination statuses.
Okay, all right. Yeah, well, vaccination status is that's more around staff. Again, it's up to you as to whether you include that information or not. The RACGP recommend that you do, and in fact, in the when we go into that training session, we pre-populate that immunisation recommendations up to the latest level that the college recommend that a general practice considers. It's not mandatory, obviously, but that they consider. Again, it's up to you whether you use that or not. But in effect, because you are putting that data in there, it is medical information and is specific to an individual. So you are right. But again, I can only come back and say that the security within the tool is pretty robust.
Ellen, you wanted to jump in here?
Yes, I might jump in for a different topic again. John, you pointed out how you can access the tool, how you can register. The process when you want to apply for a PHN funded license is a bit different. You would submit an application on the Primary Health Network website. As outlined in my presentation, there's a link. You would click on that and then apply for a PHN funded website license. And once that is, you were successful and that is confirmed, the ERPT team will register you from the back end. So that process is a bit different to the process, for example, when you're not from the Hunter, New England and Central Coast area or not eligible for a funded license. You still want to use it, then follow John's instructions, please. And another question that reached me during the work on this activity was a practice asking us what level of data is disclosed to the Primary Health Network. And I have to say, we can't access the information that's included in your business continuity plan. We can't access any contents. The only thing that will be disclosed to us is if you're a PHN funded license holder, if you have started using the tool and if you have completed the training. That's the only information we will receive. So that information lies safely within the server and is not shared to any third party, including the Primary Health Network.
Yeah, and I would like to reiterate that we take security very seriously. That unique username and password is unique to you as a practice. Again, if you come to us and say, would you like you would like us to reset your password, we can do that. But again, we would put that in the audit trail. On occasions, we will have practices coming to us and saying, could you have a look at what we've put in there and give us some feedback? Now, we're happy to do that, but again, the same caveat, which is we would need to put that reason to get in and look at your plan within the audit trail. Typically, we do not look at the content. That is your proprietary information.
Okay, well, thank you very much. No more questions have come through, so I just wanted to thank John and Ellen for your presentations today. John, just a fantastic job. Thank you so much. Ellen, you're always helpful, and I'm sorry that we can't see your beautiful face. I wanted to thank
unfortunately, that didn't work today.
I wanted to thank all of our attendees. I understand that this is your lunchtime, your spare time, and we do appreciate you spending it with us. Apologies for the IT issues, but I feel like that's just the world we live in now. But I do appreciate your patience around that. So thank you once again, and look after one another.
Thank you, Phoebe.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.